our
Okay.
start our stuff for today. And what I was saying
Let
is the
us
information
pray.
that I sent you on the
Yes, I got it.
eldership is. Teo, can you mute your mic, please? Thank you. It's something we've worked on here, part of Mission Journeys. As you probably noted, my dad has had something to do with it in terms of some of the organization and even working with some of the Greek portions of it. But this was designed to be used to talk to people in congregations that are elders or are thinking about being elders as a training tool. And I thought, well, if at least if we go through this and you want to use it in your churches, then you're more than welcome to do so. So, but that's the reason for using what we have there. So this starts off with three objectives: to acknowledge the characteristics that are set apart as an elder. And what you're going to note is that on each one of those pages that I sent you, in the upper right-hand corner, you're going to see something that, like on the first one, it says above reproach. Well, that's one of those characteristics that is mentioned in combination with looking at the Titus and the Timothy passages. All right, so you'll see that as you go through it. Also, there are pictures across the top of the page, and they represent some of those things that would be good characteristics of an elder, all right, in terms of they're kind of cartoonish, but that's what they are. And there are 12 of them. So there's a page, they're at the top of 2 pages, and they just repeat after that. Then we're going to identify teaching and shepherding as the focus of the work as an elder. And I don't know, this last one might not be as pertinent to you as it is sometimes here in our country, but if we've got elders working, then we also find ourselves in situations where sometimes the elder feels like he can never keep up and can't keep up with the work that's ahead of him in terms of that role. So in trying to make sure that in context that they keep their focus, all right? So, and then we find ourselves in that Ephesians 4 passage that we've talked about periodically throughout this, and it just says that, and he gave some as apostles, some as prophets, and some as evangelists, and some as pastor and teacher, all right? So with that said, and this is kind of and like we mentioned last week, deacon is not mentioned in that list, guys. It's not. All right. So kind of if you go back and you think about what we talked about last week, that deacon is not talked about as a part of this process. Not to say that it's not a role. It just means that it wasn't one that Paul mentioned at this point in this junction in his conversation. And it may be like we said that he didn't mention deacon because he believes that we all are servants. Everything we're doing is a servant type, servant to the work. So, and then we talked about the idea that there are, and we've talked about this from the beginning, about the idea of there being temporary leaders and there being permanent leaders. And we mentioned that, and I'm not going to spend any time here, guys. I'm just going to keep moving. We talked about the apostles and the prophets as being temporary leaders. All right, we talked about that pretty much prior to Christmas. So I'm not going back over that information again at all. The information's there if you want to do it. Then we said that the permanent ones that are mentioned are evangelist and the elder. And in my understanding is that whenever you look at that passage and it says, and some as pastors and teachers, that's not separate. That's one role. That's that elder role as being the shepherd and teacher of the flock. So keep that in mind as we continually think about this Ephesians 4 passage. So again, come back and talk about the idea that there's a role of shepherd and teacher, and those were important roles for the elder themselves. And then we're familiar with that passage in Romans 12. If we go to Romans 12 this morning, we and starting in verse 6, and he says, and since we have gifts that differ according to grace given to us, let each exercise them accordingly, of prophecy according to the proportion of his faith, and service in his service, or his who teaches in his teaching, for he who exhorts in his exhortation, and he who gives with liberality, he who leads with diligence, and he who shows mercy with cheerfulness. So 3 of these deal with teaching, the idea of prophesying, teaching, and exhortation, and 4 deal with service. It talks about service, it talks about giving, it talks about ruling, and it talks about showing mercy. And it's just the fact that no one person would possess strong characteristics in all 7 areas of those that are listed. We may have some areas, but not all would have those. And I mentioned there that the characteristics for a deacon are given in as alongside of those with the elders but is not a part of this particular study. So we find ourselves in this next section dealing with that there are 4 words, and again, my expertise is not in the Greek language, so I've worked with Dad to help get some of this together and pull some of this together. Lute would be able to chime in if he was here on this particular piece, but I think he's with family today. But Paul called the elders presbyteros to meet him. That's what he said in Acts 20, and then in Acts 20:28, he called the same men bishops. So he talked about the term of bishop later, but as of now, that's those that he also uses the term for shepherd in Acts 20:28, and he uses the one that refers to teacher in Ephesians 4. So those are the four ones that are talked about, the term elder appears 14 times in Acts in the epistles as the leaders of the church, and prophet only appears 8 times to leaders as a term about them. So let's talk about the first one, the one that he called, and this one just means to be mature men, that they're mature, they're not, and a lot of times if we go back and we look, this has to do a lot with even, it has to do with age and wisdom, the idea that they are wise people. And I guess that's we look at that qualification for an elder, and it's someone that is spiritually mature, and typically for someone to be spiritually mature, they're going to have to have some time and age to get them help build that maturity means you're going to have some age in order to have some spiritual maturity. It does, in it, there is a connection here to the idea that that they were chosen from older men, I guess, too, in terms of the eldership was. It, just because of that connection. Also, it reflects in that in the church that reverence was found for age. In other words, and I don't know, that at times is a struggle in our society today, that people don't tend to at times have any kind of I don't know if reverence is the word I want to use, but just even acknowledge the fact that people that have age and have lived longer have a broader experience of life and have wisdom that they can pass on to younger people, and some of the generation people we have today just don't accept that piece. So so think about that a little bit, and probably some of that may be true in the Philippines. I'm speaking when I say that about things here in the U.S. that there is sometimes older people aren't respected much. You know, they're and we see that in many aspects, including hiring practices for jobs, and you know, that once people get old enough that they need Social Security and those kinds of things, that sometimes it's almost like they're tossed out unless there's some kind of connection in family or church or in some level of that. But as a generality in society, I mean, even to some point, there's conversation from President Obama when he was in office, that, you know, that they would make the decision that when it come to healthcare, that it was too expensive to perform that surgery on a person that was that old, so we just won't do it. We'll just let the person die. I mean, so there was even some element of that in conversation here. So, but
I think, sir, it depends upon the culture, sir.
yeah, it does very much depend on the culture. You're right.
Because here in the Philippines, most of the adult persons are highly respected, and the family takes care of them.
Well, I'm glad that's true, because that to me is definitely more of a biblical way of handling it. All right, it truly is, and we see that relationship true not just in the New Testament with handling, you know, having elders, but we can look back into the Old Testament and find the same kind of respect given to the men of those days also, in terms of the older men were respected even underneath the law of Moses. And we know that the Jewish elder was there to share the load of the work of which Moses had given them. You know, we find even examples in Ruth that the elders of that particular town, if you remember the story, were called to the gate of the city, and at that gate of the city, they, you know, Boaz basically looked at the one man and said, and I don't remember his name offhand, and said, you know, she rightfully should be underneath your care, but are you going to accept the responsibility? Because he didn't want her, because he didn't want to have to break give a share of his of his wealth at his time to that particular to Boaz. All right, and but I guess the point I'm getting at is that decision was made, and they had something about a shoe kind of thing, that they made a decision and all understood what it meant, that he was relinquishing his rights to take her and Boaz took her and married her. And that's the, and those men, those elders of the city there were then the witnesses to the legal matter, not just of that, but all things that happened at the time. We also find that the leaders of the church in Jerusalem were called elders. And it was a group of elders that made that. We understand that James was the brother of Jesus, was probably in that grouping, and concluded that he was also a elder also. So you just continue to think about those particular things in terms of the fact that the concept of male leadership, and I'll back up and say older male leadership, being involved in the work of the church, or the, I won't say the church, yes, but you go back further than that in terms of things that were going on in Jewish life, the things that were happening in community, the things that were being done in terms of legal matters. The elders have played a role throughout the history of what God used as a model, whether it's under the Mosaic law or underneath the new covenant with Jesus. All of them played a role in terms of being an elder, it being of age. We find too that we don't know how many elders were in Jerusalem, but we don't get a count. We know that we get a plural. In other words, so we know that it's at more than one, at least two in that particular. And they operated a council to make policy decisions. And if you notice that the time that that Peter had to defend his actions with Cornelius, he came back to that group and talked to them about that. And also Paul, when there were some Jewish leaders that wanted to force circumcision on the Gentiles, came back and they made the policy. And actually James spoke up and said, let's do this. Let's not, we'll do. And he wrote that letter, and then it was dispersed out about not eating of meats that was had been sacrificed to idols and so forth on that particular letter. So the elders, we can see that in the church in Jerusalem, that older group of people and the men did some work with the idea that they wanted to maintain morality among those, and gave that direction, and also to make social relations between the Jews and the Gentiles to be one body, so that they would not eat the sacrificed idols. So it was definitely a sense of what the elders did at that time. But if we go beyond Jerusalem, there are at least two elders in every city. That was, Acts 14, and then Titus. In Titus, they talk about it's not elder, it's elders. So there is a plural there, that there needs to be at least two. And then we find that that there's some things that. So if we look at James 5, verse 14, we find that, there's some roles that the elder played. So in James 5, we find that in verse 5, we find that if anyone among you is sick, let him call for the elder of the church and let him pray over him, anointing with oil in the name of the Lord. And we will talk about that passage a little more as we get further back in this study. But I think let's talk a little bit about some of the other things that were being said in First Peter. We turn over a little bit further in First Peter 5, verse 1. We find that therefore exhort the elders among you, and you fellows, elders and witnesses of the suffering of Christ, and partaker also the glory that is to be revealed. But they talk there about the idea of being to submit to one another, and then in 1 Timothy 5:19, we find the concept of that they're, in terms of the idea is there that they're supposed to be respected. Now we find evening, Godella. Glad you could get on with us this morning or this afternoon or this evening. Thank you. Good to have you with us. But the whole point here being is that, that you should respect your elders. You shouldn't bring up false accusations about them. And Timothy does open the door to say that if you do end up with elders that are not correctly doing the work and there needs to be a reason to remove them or have discipline among them, then it can be done, but you have to at least have 2 or 3 witnesses to come forward to make the statement about them. Now, and I've been in one church situation where we had to do it, which was not pleasant at all, guys. It was awful, to be honest with you. All right, they were trying to basically let the church run down in attendance, and they'd already done the work to move the buildings and the property and stuff over into their name so that they could sell it and take the gain off the property. So, and that's definitely wrong. There's just no way around it. So now we've talked about the elder in terms of that old man piece, that spiritually deeper person because of age is one. So now let's talk about episkopos, and that is the idea of, I guess, in our world today, we see him as the bishop, the old overseer, the elder, but in some ways maybe we would prefer the term supervisor better in relationship to that. And some of that reasoning is just because, we don't like the term bishop because it has different connotations in our, when I think of bishop, sometimes I think of Catholicism and some of those kind of things. And overseer, the only reason at times maybe, and it may not be as true in your country as in my country, but in my country, sometimes overseer has a connotation that goes back, 150, 180 years, talking about slavery, that there was overseers that managed slaves. Well, that's not the case either in terms of an eldership. An elder, so someone that supervises. And let's look at that Acts 20:28 passage for a minute, because it's mentioned here a couple times, and uh, all right. Be on your guard for all the flock among you. The Holy Spirit has made you overseers to shepherd the church of God, which He purchased with His blood. So again, that overseer role is seen in this passage, um, and he tells those he's talking to those group of people at Ephesus, uh, and we find this particular term of overseer, supervisor, elder, however we decide to put it in context, that it's used several times. It appears 5 times. It appears here in this passage. It appears in the greeting that Paul makes to the book of Philippians. And actually, that's the one we talked about last week, is the only, other than the deacon that we found in Timothy, we also found there, in terms of that terminology, that he says greetings to the elders and the deacons, all right, and as he opens the book of Philippians. It's in the list of qualifications for the two for Timothy's, for 1 Timothy 3 and in Titus, uh, and in Titus that chapter 1 verse 7. So this is the one that is used as where he gives the instruction in the list of characteristics that are in Timothy and Titus. And then in 1 Peter 2:25, it is used as with the word shepherd as a title for Jesus. Where in the wording there is the shepherd and the bishop of your soul. So we see it overseer, and again, like I said, sometimes we don't like that word because it has that connection back to slavery in our country. So people sometimes cringe at that and don't like it. So really, we kind of like the idea of the word supervisor. And that's in harmony with the idea around 1 Peter 5 and verse 3. And the idea there is, if we go to First Peter 5, we find ourselves not he's talking about shepherd the flock in verse 2. Among you, exercise oversight, not compulsion, but voluntarily according to the will of God, and not for sword and gain, but with eagerness, nor yet is lording it over them, allotted to your charge, but provoking to be an example to the flock, but not provoking, proving to be an example to the flock. See, he's basically giving kind of a description in 1 Peter 5 verses 1 through 3. And I didn't read verse 1, therefore I exhort the elders among you as your fellow elder and witness of the suffering of Christ, and as a partaker also of the glory that is revealed to you. So he gives them instruction as to how they're supposed to be that overseer or elder or supervisor of the people. And he's basically saying, you don't lord it over them. You don't put them under compulsion, but they're voluntarily according to the will of God. And you don't do this for sword and gain, but with eagerness. And then you should be an example to them as to what God would want them to have or to be or do. So, and in Acts 20:28, there's two charges: to take heed of the flock, and they're to feed the flock. So we get the two terms there of being the shepherd and being the teacher as a part of that. And then the last one here is just in this section is the role of the bishop, overseer and elder. It must be within the description of Peter gives in 5:1 through 3, which that's the piece we just talked about. In other words, they shepherd the flock, they exercise oversight. That's not, they don't put them under compulsion. It's voluntary and it's according to their will. And then it goes on to talk about what we just talked about there. To lead the flock is the role of the shepherd, and he does say that there are the bishops of supervisors that are there. The term is not an alternate for elder. This term is an alternate for elder. And this piece is a critical piece of what elders do in terms of oversight. You know, we had our leadership meeting on Monday night, and we spent a good bit of time talking about various different aspects of what needed done at church. And you know, we talked about things that in the women's groups, we talked about things that dealt with being ready for, you know, what are we going to be able to do in terms of COVID for this summer. You know, we're beginning to look at that in terms of whether or not we can have vacation Bible school. All those things have to do with the oversight of the operation of the church at this, and how we do that. And we're, as I said last week, we're working on adding some deacons, and we're working toward that. I guess I know I'm about 10 minutes early, but I'm going to stop there for a couple reasons for today. I guess what I'd like to do is that I really don't want to start the next section and feel rushed, because I believe the shepherd role is an important role. All right, that's one. And plus, I really want to. I want us to have a conversation about Wes for a minute. All right. I think that's an important piece for us to do. And I want to make sure you understand where Wes is at right now. I don't know if what I said on BICM made sense or not, but I want to make sure you understand where Wes is. I talked to Wes yesterday for a few minutes. I don't know if you all have hospice. Is that something that you have in the Philippines? Hospice, is that a term you all use? I guess I'll ask Teo, is that a term you've heard around hospice? Your mic is still muted. No, you haven't heard it. Well, when
Have not heard that.
not something you're used to. Okay, so
Yeah.
so when Wes went in last week for the surgeries, all right, the surgery that he was supposed to have, and they were going to put in, as I mentioned, the stent. And I don't know if you know, we talked a little about a stent, but a stent goes into an artery, and it kind of springy, and it opens it up so that they can get more blood flow through. Well, because they had told Wes he was down to about 25% of his blood flow being able to get in and out of his heart, and also in and out of his legs, where he had those. And his legs, I thought his legs were a diabetes issue, but it wasn't. It was when he had open heart surgery 20, 30 years ago. And at that time, the procedure was to take the veins out of your legs, all right, and graft them in at your heart, is what they did. Now they don't do that anymore. But anyways, but when they got in, they found that things were much worse. And I think they found a damaged valve in his heart. And because of that, they said that there really wasn't anything they could do for him. That, you know, the surgery wasn't going to be, and they really had no other options at this point in order to